How's it everyone? This is Lolcohol. Today's video is the Kinetic Fusillade Elementalist build guide. This skill, I still think it is flying completely under the radar. It has excellent clear, it has incredible single target, it's very fun to play, and it's a really interesting and unique skill. Today's build guide is going to be a little bit different from what you're used to. I firstly really encourage you to read through the written guide that's up on Mobilytics. I'll link it in the description. Another reason I want you to check out the written guide is that I'm constantly going to be updating that as more tests are done with the skill. This is a very new skill. We're constantly doing testing, so things change. At the bottom of the build guide, I'll add a changelog. If there are any major changes, I will put that in. For example, one is Sacred Wisps. It felt like it wasn't working, then it did feel like it was working, then it felt like it wasn't. Now it feels like it's working again, so we might be putting that in. Check the build guide maybe once every couple of days just to see if there are any major updates. But in this video, I'm going to cover the most critical parts of the build, but then I'm going to explain why I've made the decisions I've made for the build and how that impacts the build's performance. So we'll go over things like how Kinetic Fusillade works, scaling your damage, so you're dealing as much damage as possible, but also then exploring the defensive layers. So even though this guide does include all the gems, all the gear pieces, and which points to take on the tree, I'm hoping that by the end of this, you will hopefully understand it to the point where you could have made similar decisions yourself. All right, Kinetic Fusillade. This is a new skill that came out this league. The way this functions is, you perform an attack, and this summons a hovering projectile above your character. And then after a short duration, that projectile is fired out at the enemy, dealing area damage and chaining between targets. This has like an auto aim feel to it, but it also has a built-in chain. You can also build up to a maximum of 12 projectiles before releasing, and then projectiles deal 12% per previous projectile fired in sequence. So the more you summon above you before releasing, the more damage you're going to do, not only from having a greater number of projectiles, but from this more multiplier on the skill. So that looks a bit like this. You attack, you wait, they release. You attack, wait, release. So going into the first form of scaling that I spoke about, increasing your attack speed will make you generate these more quickly. Then any increases to number of projectiles with something like Greater Volley, which makes you fire 4 additional projectiles, that's going to make you, for every attack, summon that many more anomalies. So instead of attacking 12 times to get to 12, if I have, let's say, 5 additional projectiles, that'll mean instead of attacking 12 times, I'll only have to attack twice to get up to the maximum number of 12. The other part of scaling this skill is that of the duration before firing. So if we can lower the duration, that is going to reduce the time before it fires off. So it'll lower the delay before these projectiles shoot off, but it also lowers the duration between each projectile. So these projectiles are released in sequence, like one at a time. Lowering our duration, our skill duration, will make them shoot off more rapidly. But now, the thing that most of us have been doing is a version of this build where there is no delay before firing. So it just looks like this. You're not waiting for those projectiles to hover above you before releasing them. The way that we get this is by having the duration, as you can see on the skill there, duration 0.07 seconds. If that duration is lower than our attack time, then we will immediately release the projectiles when we attack, because they're held in the air for a shorter duration than it takes for us to perform another attack that would then add another projectile before it's released. There are some complexities to this, and I really encourage you to watch a video. I'm going to link it in the description about how to optimize this, because what can happen is if your attack speed is too high, then you end up interrupting your projectile release. So basically what happens, like I said, the projectiles fire off in a sequence. They're not instant. If you attack again before the projectiles have finished releasing, you don't end up firing off those remaining ones. This is almost impossible to see, but in my other video, which I really encourage you to watch, you can see that. But I don't want to rehash it in this video. Go watch that one, please. It's very important. So now we understand. For Kinetic Fusillade, we want to have additional projectiles. We want to have a lower duration and a decent amount of attack speed. Question is, how do we lower the duration? That's where Time Clasp comes in. So this ring can roll -20 to +20 increased skill effect duration. If it is negative, it'll show reduced skill effect duration. You can check my duration. Without the ring is 0.13 seconds. With the ring, it's 0.07. We can also use a warped timepiece. Then the next thing is to use less duration support. This will give us 60% with quality, less skill effect duration. Now, there's also some points on the tree that we can take. Most importantly is window of opportunity for another 15% reduced skill effect duration. Early on, we anoint this. Later, we get this rather expensive impossible escape, which allows us to take these extra points as well for another 10% reduced skill effect duration. And then we can anoint hasty demise. So with all of these combined, what we end up with is a very short duration and an attack speed that allows us to just fire off these volleys at about, it's approximately 91 projectiles a second. Now, when you're leveling this skill, you are not going to be using the Gattling gun version. You're not going to be using this auto hold and they just fire off. Instead, what it'll look like is more like this, where you build up and then release, build up and release. So in the leveling tree, it looks slightly different because we actually want to have very high attack speed. We're not concerned about those interruptions of our projectiles. So we take things like one slinger. The goal early on is just build up to those 12 charges as quickly as possible and then release them as quickly as possible. So we do that by getting increased attack speed and then more projectiles so that we have to perform fewer attacks to get to max. And then less duration means they are hanging in the air for a shorter period and they fire off in rapid succession. So that's it for just the basic function of Kinetic Fusillade. Again, please watch that other video. It's very important for this skill. This skill is more complicated than it appears on the surface. And if you get that wrong, you can be dropping 50% of your damage. It's a fairly short video, so give it a watch. Now, the next thing to discuss is damage scaling on Kinetic Fusillade. And now this is more generic advice that can be applied to most other skills. So we firstly have that layer of the duration, the projectiles, and the attack speed. But then the next thing is how damage in this game works. And I think probably the best way to illustrate that is to hop into PoE and to just show it to you, because all of that information is right here. This is how you can learn how to scale damage in this game, but there's different layers. You can, I guess some people think of these as like buckets, but first layer is your flat damage. So your flat lightning, cold, and fire. So here we have a flat of 49 to 723. Let's just average this out for the sake of basic maths to 500 on average. Then after you have that, you have your increases. So these are percent increases to that number. Let's say we have 500. We're increasing it by 200%. So now we have 1,500. Then the next thing is any more multipliers. So more multipliers are much less common in PoE, but these are like another multiplier that happens after the flat and the increases. So if we have 500 increased by 200%, we have 1,500 increased by 50%, we have 2,250 damage. Now I'm explaining this to you because I often get asked, people will see me killing Ubers really quickly and they say, oh, how do you do that? Like, I'm dealing no damage. Most often what is happening is there is a gap somewhere in this process. So you need to have the flat damage in order for it to be scaled by the increase and the more multipliers. So this flat damage, where are we getting it from? We can actually see on this thing over here. So we're getting it from our wand, gloves, from our Ash Graft. We can also get it from Wrath, Sigil of Power. There's all these various sources of gaining flat damage. Then the next step is increasing that damage. And again, we go to the next thing. So we can see over here, how are we increasing that initial amount? And we're doing it with things like the taming, points on the tree, with Trinity. So these are very important. If you, let's say, have 10,000% increased damage, but your base damage is like 10, it's not as impactful as having like 1,000 base damage, but you're only increasing it by 500%. Then the next thing are these more multipliers. Like I said, these are rarer. So for this, our main more multipliers are going to be things like Trinity and then Kinetic Fusillade as a skill. We're also getting it from things like Frenzy Charges, and then some of our support gems also have that. So a support gem like Elemental Damage with Attacks, that's another more multiplier. But there are further multipliers to this effective damage mods that we can get. So let's say you have your 100 damage hit, increase it by 100%, now dealing 200 damage, and then you get a 50% more multiplier. So now you're dealing 300 damage, but then the monster has 50% lightning resistance. In that case, you would deal only 150 damage to the monster, but there are other things like lightning penetration, which means that it's getting through that resistance. So there are these secondary layers of like penetration, inverted resistances, and lowering enemy resistances. So the first part is like stuff we're doing to increase our damage, and then stuff that we are doing to cut through the defenses of the enemy. So that is where things like elemental penetration is really strong, or lowering the resistance of the enemy. Other things we can do to further increase our damage is with things like shock. So shock, let's say we have a 50% shock on a monster. That means that monster takes 50% increased damage. It's not the same as us dealing 50% increased damage, which, as you can imagine, if you have like 100 damage and you're already dealing 300% increased damage, it's not as impactful as when that monster takes the hit after all of our increase and reductions, then they take another 50% on top of that. So there are these further scaling layers with things like shock. We're also improving and further scaling our damage with things like crit. So let's say we have a 100% chance to crit. Our critical strike multiplier is 361%. So then the hit deals that much more damage. So I'm hoping this makes sense to help you understand how to scale your damage. If you feel like I'm dealing no damage, I don't understand, like what's wrong. Main thing is to go over here and see like, do I have enough flat damage? Like, do I have this important layer on my build? And then do I have these increases and these more multipliers? Am I applying enough penetration? Am I shocking the enemy consistently? But this can be applied to most builds in this game. Flat, increase, more, and then anything that like damages the enemy's defensive layers. The other part of that is your attack or cast rate, as in how quickly you are attacking or how many projectiles you're firing off, which we spoke about in the previous section. So now if we look at the gear that we are using, I hope that some of that's going to make sense. So on our wand, we have flat cold damage and flat lightning damage. Now, one thing to point out is that with Kinetic Fusillade, there's an important line. Increases and reductions to spell damage also apply to attack damage from this skill at 150% of their value. So if we get increased spell damage, let's say 100% increased spell damage, it would apply to this as 150% increased attack damage, which then multiplies that flat number over here, which then gets multiplied further by the more multiplier. So for this, what is actually ideal is lightning. So we got that flat lightning, then the spell damage, and then we're also getting crits, so crit chance, and the crit multiplier, and then also the penetration that I spoke about. However, one important thing to point out is we're using a gem called Trinity. This requires us to have at least 2 elemental damage types, where one sometimes hits harder than the other. If we get that, then we get the benefits of Trinity, which grants us elemental penetration and also more elemental damage. So that is the reason that we are instead opting for flat cold and flat lightning versus flat lightning and spell damage. So if we look at our gloves now, you can see cold damage to attacks, lightning damage to attacks. Those are those flat values that are then getting increased. Also, another thing to mention is stuff like accuracy, so that when we do attack, the attacks hit. Another thing, the taming, 40% increased elemental damage with hits and ailments for each type of elemental ailment on the enemy. So if we are applying ailments such as chill, freeze, shock, ignite, then we are doing increased damage and increasing that flat amount. So these gear pieces should now make sense to you. There are other things like rage that grants more damage. Also lightning exposure that further like cuts into the enemy's defense. But yes, hopefully this is making sense now. Now there's another section of damage, and that is clear versus burst damage. So with clear, that is like general mapping. How easily are you able to clear packs of enemies around you? And then burst is stuff like, are you able to temporarily boost your damage in such a way that you can get down like a beefy target more quickly? So we have a few layers of bursts, and we're going to speak about our grafts here. Firstly, we have Storming Ashgraft, which grants us Wreathed in Light. This will call down a ring of bolts, lightning bolts, that don't really do a whole lot, but then it leaves this Radiant Ground. This Radiant Ground will make our damage with hits lucky and cause us to deal added lightning damage. So what lucky means is that the damage will be rolled twice and the best result is used. So it's like advantage in D&D or something. But this is particularly useful with lightning damage that generally has a very low and a very high roll. So if I were to roll like an 18 and then a 279, it would pick the 279. So this is perfect for our build. So for this graft, when you use it, you must just move and stand on the Radiant Ground. And this gives us a temporary burst of damage. The other thing that helps just for clear, but also for burst, is Overcharged Sinews from our Jolting Ashgraft. When you crit an enemy, you gain a stack of Jolt. Jolt grants more maximum attack damage at the cost of taking increased damage, and it can stack up to 10 times. So this makes us squishier, but it does give us between 10 more maximum damage on a low level one, up to 30% more maximum attack damage on a high level one. And remember, if we're talking about those flat damage and then the increase and then the more, this should make it obvious why this is like a massive amount of damage. It's giving us 30% more maximum attack damage. And then when combined with Radiant Ground, where it rolls twice, that's giving us a higher chance that we get a high roll on our hit, dealing more damage. So these are very, very important for our damage. Another element of our burst is Sigil of Power. This will place a sigil on the ground, and as we spend mana in it, it builds up stages, and those stages grant us flat added lightning damage. And on top of that, we take less damage while it is at maximum stages. So this is another point of burst. So when it comes to bosses, what I'm doing is I'm pushing my Sigil of Power, pushing my Radiant Ground, standing on it, and then attacking the boss. Now, just speaking about Sigil of Power quickly, this skill has a duration, which is kind of in direct opposition to how we're building everything else. Because of the Kinetic Fusillade, we're trying to get less duration on the skill. So our Sigil of Power doesn't actually last that long. When linked with a 20/20 quality more duration, it only lasts for about 4.5 seconds. So with this skill, it's important to check how much mana you need to spend in it before it reaches the next stage, so that you're able to rapidly push it up to maximum stages and then gain the benefit of it being at maximum stages before it runs out. So one thing you can do is go into your pub, and my mana cost per second is 190. We're also using a tornado, which I'll explain in a sec, which further increases our mana cost per second. So we're spending about 220 mana per second. If we check out the gem in-game, this builds up stages when we spend 213 mana. So we're spending about that much mana every second. So we're building up, actually getting it to max stage at least for like a second, and then attacking. Once you've got this build set up right, normally that's enough to burst down even pinnacle bosses. So that is just an important thing. It's just to understand the balance between Sigil of Power and your actual mana cost. Another point of burst is that of Tornado, which we are linking with Spellslinger. So this is a reservation skill that will cause the socketed spell to trigger when we fire projectiles from a non-triggered wand attack. So what that looks like is this. That tornado is happening when we attack. Without going into too much detail, this allows us to shotgun our enemy with the tornado and the Kinetic Fusillade. It does mean that we have to have a more close combat playstyle. One thing you can opt for instead, and something I was using and is in the build guide, is Hydrosphere, which functions not quite in the same way, but it allows for a more further distance playstyle while gaining some of the benefit that you get from Tornado. But late game, Tornado is an important part of our burst arsenal. And then when it comes to clear, the built-in chain on Kinetic Fusillade and the explosions from that, as well as the explosions from Herald of Ice, this is going to improve our clear speed. So there's those two elements. You got like your mapping, and then you got your burst, killing bosses as quickly as possible. So I'm hoping that after explaining that section on the scaling, you're able to look at the various parts of the build and the skill tree and say, oh, I see why he's doing that. It's because it does this, which makes it deal more damage because of X, Y, Z. Let me know in the comments if this made sense or if this was like enlightening just for like general build crafting. But I wanted to explain that rather than doing the whole take this makes you deal more damage and that, because I don't feel like that's particularly useful. Now, the next thing we need to speak about is the other half of your character, is your defense. So it's cool dealing lots of damage, but if you're constantly dying, that sucks. So the way that I think about defenses in PoE 1 and PoE 2 is sort of like an order of operations. This is quite simplified, but I hope it is going to make sense once I explain it. So the first layer is we have an avoidance layer. Imagine a monster coming in with an attack or a spell, and then the question is, does it hit? Or are you able to avoid it entirely in some way or another? So with regards to this version of the build, our avoidance is coming from evasion rating and block. So block, if you take a hit, but you block it, you take no damage. So it acts effectively as an avoidance layer. You're avoiding taking damage from the hit. The next thing is, if you do take the hit, you fail to avoid it, then how do you reduce that amount of damage coming in? So that is our mitigation layer. So let's say you take 100 fire damage and then you have 75% fire resistance. Instead of taking 100 fire damage, you will instead then take 25. So you've mitigated it by 75%. So there's two types of mitigation. The first one is going to be physical mitigation and then elemental mitigation. So for most builds, they will fairly easily solve their elemental mitigation just by having capped resistances. Of course, you can get max res that further mitigates that damage. However, physical mitigation is a bigger problem for most builds, or it is something that people tend to overlook a bit. We also have a general mitigation layer, which is just any reduction to damage you take. So like our Sigil of Power, like I said, when it is at max stages, we take less damage. There's also things like spell suppression, which just reduces spell damage. So then the next thing, we have failed to avoid the hit. We've taken the hit and reduced it. The next thing is, can you survive the hit? And that is our next defensive layer, which is our HP. That can either be life or energy shield, or if you're using mind over matter, your mana is part of your HP. There's also ward, that's also part of it. So the next thing is your HP. Now the next thing, and this is the most important layer that the majority of, I would say like even decently experienced players don't properly cover, and that is your recovery layers. So again, you've failed to take the hit, you failed to avoid it, you have mitigated it, then you have taken that damage, your HP has been reduced, and then the next question is, how do you get your life back? And that is your recovery layer. So recovery, I break it down into two things. You have passive recovery, which is just like, let's say, life regenerated per second. And then you have active recovery, which is something like, let's say, leech, when you attack and you hit an enemy, you get some life back. But there's the passive, which is like, I'm doing nothing, I'm getting my life back. And then there's the active of, I'm doing this thing and therefore my life is going up. That could be something like using a life flask, or like I said, leech, or even something like recoup. That's another form of active recovery. Now, there are more layers to defense. So I would say like secondary layers are things like movement speed and mobility in general, like being able to move quickly and avoid stuff. There's also stuff like freeze. If you're able to stop your enemy from moving, they can't hit you. There's also damage, as in just like if you kill the thing before it can do anything, it's not going to hit you. And then there's also stuff like general game knowledge, understanding, let's say during a boss fight, knowing what their moves do, knowing what they look like. You're able to defend yourself by just being good at the game. With that out of the way, let's just talk about the various versions of this build with regards to those defensive layers. So starting early maps, for our avoidance layer, early on, we just have a little bit of evasion rating, which is primarily coming from just gear that we have equipped. You can also throw on like a jade flask to further improve this avoidance layer. We're also using a shield, which then gives us a bit of block chance. That's another avoidance layer. But then when it comes to mitigation, particularly physical mitigation, this Ghastly Theater is very nice for a bit of physical mitigation. It grants us physical Aegis when equipped, which grants us like a physical damage buffer for our character. But we're also taking Shaper of Flames. Hits always ignite. If the target is ignited, then we will take 40% of their physical damage as fire damage, which will then be reduced by our fire resistance. So if they deal, let's say, 100 physical damage, we convert 40% of that. So we take 60 physical damage and 40 fire damage. Then that 40 fire damage is reduced by 75% from our fire res. So we actually only take 10 fire damage. So the total amount we would take then would be like 60 fizz and 10 fire instead of the full 100. For our HP, we just have a decent amount of life and energy shield, and we have leech from the tree, also getting recovery from flasks. Then moving on into the next version of the build, like level 93, we are further scaling our physical mitigation with Shaper of Flames, but then we're throwing in a Dawnbreaker. This is a great shield early on, 19% of physical damage taken as fire. And then we also use a Ruby Flask, which grants us 5% to maximum fire resistance. So let's just say the enemy is ignited. We have a perfect roll on our Dawnbreaker. Then they hit us for 100 fire damage. 40% gets converted from this, and then another 20% from this. So instead, now we're taking 40 fizz, 60 fire, and then that 60 fire is being reduced by 81%. So we actually only take 11 fire damage and then 40 physical damage. So we're reducing that by about half. Further recovery layers on this version of the build are just more leech, and our HP layer is more robust with higher life and higher energy shield. But then we're moving into CI, which is Chaos Inoculation. Max life becomes 1, immune to chaos damage. So instead of going for life and energy shield, we're just going pure energy shield. We no longer take any chaos damage. And then for our primary avoidance layer, we're actually swapping into block. So we're getting a much higher block chance, and we have a much higher HP pool. And then in terms of recovery, we're using Ghost Reaver. So we're leeching energy shield instead of life. This does mean that our ES cannot recharge though. But further mitigation layers, still using Shaper of Flames. And then we're not using Dawnbreaker anymore. So how do we compensate for the loss of that shield? Instead, we're using Endurance Charges. These grant us 4% less physical and elemental damage taken per charge. So physical elemental damage reduction per endurance and elemental reduction per endurance. So there's another 12% because we have 3. So we're mitigating it like that. And then we can also get things like 11% of physical damage from hits taken as chaos. So we take that chaos damage, but we're immune to chaos, so we take no chaos damage. And then, like I said, in terms of recovery, we've got our Ghost Reaver, but we can also get a shield with recover % of energy shield on block. So when we do block, we're getting a chunk of our energy shield back. But now I want to speak about the current version of the build I'm playing, which is the Ward version. Nemrod shared this with me, and I think it is the way to play this version of the build, the CI version at least. So Ward, let's just quickly explain it. Ward is effectively like an HP buffer, where you either have ward or you do not have ward. So if we do take a hit that deals damage to us, even if it is like 2 damage, our ward will instantly break and that will be gone. However, if we do take a very big hit, the damage will first be taken from the ward. Let's say we take a 4,000 damage hit, that will be taken from our ward, and then any remaining bit will be taken from our energy shields. So why are we using this? Well, this creates a very powerful mitigation layer that I feel like the CI version was missing a bit. One thing to point out with ward though is ward generally has a 2-second recovery time. So when something does hit us, then it will take 2 seconds to get our ward back before we have that life buffer again. But with the new Ascendancy, this is the one from Olroth. You can get this by completing a logbook, area level 81 with Knights of the Sun. So you open those, you check for a little boss icon. When you find it, run the boss, kill the boss, and then you get access to this. And what we are taking is Boon of the River, 5% chance to restore your ward on hit. So currently we are firing about 91 projectiles a second. This means that even if something does get through our ward and break that defensive layer, we're able to almost instantly restore it, meaning that we have a life buffer of about 3,500. You can get that much higher as well. That is just constantly recovering as we're attacking. So this is the version of the build that I felt most comfortable playing in tier 17 maps and doing Ubers with. It feels really, really good. Even though in PoB, if you open up PoB, you might see like, oh, the EHP went down. In practice, this is much tankier than the other versions of the build. Now, how do we get this ward? Main thing is we're using this belt, Understand, which grants us gain ward instead of 50% of armor and evasion rating from your equipped body armor. So we're, instead of using a pure energy shield body armor, we're using a hybrid evasion rating energy shield necrotic armor. So this currently has about 3,000 evasion rating. With quality, we can get this up to 60% of our evasion rating from equipped body armor is instead converted to ward. So that'll be about 1,800 ward. Then we are further scaling that with Runegraft of the Fortress for 40% increased global defenses. Global defensives includes ward, so that is being increased by that amount. This is very strong, but the reduced attributes can be a pain in the butt because our necrotic armor has quite a hefty dexterity requirement, and also our less duration. Some of our other sports have about 114 strength requirements. So that's why I'm not recommending jumping into this version too early, because you're going to have to start juggling like your resistances and your attributes. But I think this is currently the best version of the build that I've played up until now. And another thing that we are using to further scale our ward is with one of our golems. We are using golems, and one of these guys, this guy over here, grants 20% increased defenses. So this combined with the Runegraft is meaning that that amount of ward we're getting from our chest is being scaled quite significantly. That also scales our evasion rating and our energy shield as well. On this version, we also have a decent-ish evasion rating. So with our flask up, it's about 9k. I do want to get this higher. I can do that. But we also have very, very good block chance. So we're sitting at 73, 74. So those are our avoidance layers, block and evasion rating, which combines really nicely with our ward. So if an enemy attacks and it does break our ward, then we're firing 91 projectiles a second and also hopefully not actually taking hits that would then, while our ward is depleted, go through to our energy shield and be able to kill us. And then for mitigation, we're also now throwing in spell suppression again. We're also still using our endurance charges and fizz taken as chaos. One thing I just want to point out, do pay attention to your flasks. Your flasks are very important. So I'm going to leave the rest to you. This video is long enough. Read the skill gems. I'm not going to read skill gems at you and tell you what they do. That is up to you. Hopefully that with this video, everything will make sense. Why these decisions have been made, why I'm using the supports I'm using or the curses I'm using, why I'm suggesting certain gear pieces or flasks. It should all make sense. If you do have any questions though, please leave it in the comments below or join the Discord. We have a ton of people in the community who are all very willing to help each other out. So ask if you have questions, but I encourage you, please just read the build guide, go through it, read your gems, read your skills, and hopefully after watching this, you'll understand why the things that have been suggested are in the build. I also want to give a big thank you to Nemrod, who has done a lot of testing, and we've spoken a lot about this skill, trying to get it as good as possible. So big thank you to him. That's going to be it. Have a wonderful day. Stay safe. Happy kinetic fusillading, and take care. Bye-bye.